God's concealment in this world is equal in everything. God's hidden. He's concealed. His inner will, his inner being, his countenance is concealed. Everything has a klipa, a shell that covers on that presence of God. Yet, at the same time, there's a distinction in how much vitality there is, how much light there is that is in a created being. So again, the metaphor that we use is the curtain. The curtain veils, conceals that bright sunshine that you put on your window, that it's a thick curtain, so much so that the light that comes in, you'd never be aware that it's, if you didn't experience the sun itself on the outside, that this is the same sun. You wouldn't have any inkling of it, because the light is so reduced, so contracted. And then at the same time, if you put up a plywood against that contracted light, that veil, that curtain, and you bore a hole, a big hole, well, then more light comes in. A small hole is less light that comes in. The concealment is equal, but the amount of light, the amount of vitality, which light means vitality of God, that he animates creation, will be a distinction. And with this we can understand something very interesting. That there are 4 basic levels in creation: inanimate, vegetation, animal, and human. And what is the distinction? Why is there? Well, different variances of the light of God. The light of God is equally concealed in all of creation, whether it's inanimate or human. What's the proof? No one looks at a rock and unless they've been educated through study of Torah, and in particular Tanya, Chassidus, that you're going to look at a rock and say, oh, God. God's present. No one's going to even look at a human being and say, oh, God's present. In other words, it's not instinctual. Why? Because God's hidden. He's concealed. Yet, when you look at a rock versus a human, well, you do see a distinction in the form of vitality. One, the hole in the plywood is very small. Small little light comes in, creates an inanimate object. One, the light is great, and that creates human being. Why is that? What's the distinction? Well, what's the force of God that creates everything? Is his name. Oddly enough, his name has 4 letters. The end represents inanimate. The vav, that's the latter hey. The vav represents vegetation. The former hey represents the animal kingdom, and the yud represents humanness, humankind. What does that mean? It means that even in God's name, there is a contraction of the light. The light is much more powerful with the yud that creates the human being. But the human being still conceals on God. Why? Because the vitality of the countenance of God is not revealed. It's still klipa. The body is formed from klipa. Klipas noiga. The animal soul, klipas noiga. Only the godly soul. We're not speaking about the godly soul here in the act of creation. Talking about the animating soul and the body. So the human being, the yud, is what animates, and that's a greater form of vitality from God's name. There's a contraction that comes to the hey, that is the form of vitality of the animal kingdom. Then the vav is vegetation, and the final hey is the final destination, inanimate objects that are created. Everything comes from God, everything comes from his name, but concealed in Klippa is this name, in everything of creation, and therefore we have a distinction in the four categories. So all of creation, again, equally conceals on the countenance of God, the innerness of God, inner will, inner being of God, that is veiled. How much it's veiled, how much it's screened out, how much light there will be, depends on how much light is the opening, right, in that plywood, and it will create different things as a result, from inanimate vegetation, animal to human. That is all a metaphor for us to understand intention, mindfulness, then when we do an act of a mitzvah. Now, when we do the act of the mitzvah, this name of God is not concealed anymore. It is revealed. Now, whether you perceive it or not is a different story, but it's revealed. It's not in Klippa. So you're giving charity, you're putting on your tefillin, you're lighting Shabbos candles, observing Shabbos, whatever mitzvah it is, you are bound up to God. Period. Right? Why? Because in that act, you have now the inner aspect of God's will. And it's without concealment. However, you cannot regard the act of God that is an inanimate act, right, which means without intent, as God creates the world inanimate, the light is so reduced that that's why it creates an inanimate object. You can't compare that to when the light isn't reduced, because you have mindfulness, you have intent. So the light of God is much greater. As it, again, in the metaphor, gives rise, produces a human being, for example, or an animal, whatever it might be. So the light of God in that mitzvah is radiating much more when it's done with intent, right? As opposed without kavanah, without intent. So, is God found in the act itself? Absolutely. Are you attached to God in the act itself? Absolutely. But the light that's illuminating that action, when it doesn't have kavanah, it's not an expression of your mindfulness in that act. The light radiates is minimal. It's minimal. Therefore, when you're saying a prayer with kavanah, or you're saying the Shema with intent, or any of the blessings, you're attaching your thoughts and the intellect to God. And the light is illuminated, is illuminating that action, the light of God.